Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's digital event, The Impact of Poor Management. I will shortly be handing over to David, who's running the session today. If you got any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with you later on today. Now, over to David, our resident core skills expert at CMI. Enjoy the session.
Thanks, Lucia, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. As Lucia says, we're going to be talking today about the impact of poor management. And now, before I start, there are a whole load of things that impact on poor management. So I'm going to focus on a few today, and hopefully, as we go through, that will become very clear. For me, these are the key elements of poor management, and that's why I wanted to focus on these particularly. I think before we start to talk about poor management, we need to think about management in a different way. We need to change our thinking and develop a different terminology in relation to managers. And I think this will help us deal with poor management as well. Now, some of the reasons for poor management are around people becoming accidental managers. We have this phrase, accidental managers, where you take somebody who's really good at their job, that may be technical or specialist job, something like IT or teaching. We used to see it a lot in teaching. And you promote somebody because they're really good at their job. And you promote them into a job where they're not prepared, they're not supported, they're not trained. And we sometimes see management as just a slightly more, shall we say, higher level than a specialist job. And actually, for me, management is a completely separate role. It's a completely separate discipline. And we need to think about it differently in order that we can support people that are put into positions of management and positions of authority where we're looking at a different skill set, we're looking at a different ability. And what we want in a manager is not necessarily what we want in an expert or specialist in any particular field. We need to think about managers as facilitators rather than dictators. You know, the days of a manager being the final word of everything have long gone and should have long gone everywhere. Sadly, they haven't, and we see this in various locations. But we need to think about managers as enabling other people to develop, to deliver, to perform to their best of their ability. And we need to get to a point where we are enabling those people to do that. We are trusting them. We are believing that they're going to do it. So we're not micromanaging. If we think about McGregor's X and Y management styles, you know, we're not saying if I don't see it, you're not doing it. What we're saying is, I trust you to do this. I believe you can do this, and I'm here to support you if you need my help. So we need to think about management in a very different way. And certainly, while most people are working remotely, and a lot of people are still working remotely, but while we've got remote staff and remote teams, we need to trust them even more. We need to believe in them even more and allow them to do what they do and encourage them and give them the environment that they can do what they do and do it well. And we can just coordinate that and facilitate that happening. And I think it's really important to remember that as we go through this process. So when we think about what's good and what's bad, and you know, some of the classic questions that you come up with on a management training course, you know, people will say, how would you describe a good manager? And how would you describe a poor manager? And most of us know what it is that makes a manager poor, or a bad manager even. But often what makes a manager a good manager is a feeling. You know, this feels good. This is enabling me to flourish. This person supports me. They trust me. They allow me to get on with my work. They're not micromanaging. But what we have to remember is when we think about these things, it's relative to our own experience and our own needs. So you could have two people with the same manager having very different experiences. And one might say, this manager is a really good manager. For me, they're really good. I need what they give me. A colleague may say, they don't give me what I need. And so we have to start saying, okay, there is no black and white for a good and bad manager. And I think this is where things like Maya Angelou come into play here. You know, when she says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think if we reflect on our own experiences with managers, we can see where we've had somebody who's made us feel really good about ourselves, really good about our job, really bad about ourselves, really bad about our job. We've felt like poor performance. We felt like a failure often, and we've often left because of that experience that we've had. Now, I think it's behaving on both sides of this equation, both the managers and the people that are being managed, to be able to stand up and say, this is what I need. You're not giving me what I need. Is this a possibility? Or do I need to think about going somewhere else? Can I get my needs met here as an individual? And more nowadays, we need to think about our staff and our teams in that way, because nobody has to stay. We're not indentured staff. We're not saying you have to stay here for the rest of your working career. People aren't so needy as we were when I was young. When you got a job, you had to stay in the job because you had to pay the bills, and there was not much else work about. And so we have to think about people differently. People can move, people can complain, people get listened to a lot more now than they used to. So when you're thinking about your management style, we need to think about, how do I personally avoid being a poor manager? Now, the answer is not one thing for everybody. We need to look at our individual members of our team and look at their needs and their wants and wishes and see how many of those we can fulfill, see how many of those we can meet, but still stay within our own value stream, still stay within our organization's value stream. So we're trying to meet both sides. And that's where the role of a manager becomes really quite challenging. And it really is about enabling and facilitating that to happen. And so we can see straight away that we're moving away from our technical speciality, whether in my case, you're a teacher, or whether you're an engineer or IT or finance or whatever it might be. You're no longer doing that. Your role is now different. And if you keep that in mind, that will help you to stop being anywhere near a poor manager. I'm sure everybody on this call is a good manager and would describe themselves as a good manager. So another big problem with management is this idea of power, and I love this quote from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And that's very, very true, because where we see impacts of poor management, where we see examples of poor management, it's often about the power balance. People get power or get authority and they misuse it. So they think, now I'm in charge, you will do what I say or else. If you don't get this done, there's going to be trouble. If you don't do it, I'll get somebody in who will, and you'll be out the door. Now, those days should have gone a long time ago. Sadly, there are pockets of that still around us, as we see. And I'm sure you've all seen it in your working lives and in your experience. But those things are wrong. They don't work. They will work to a certain extent, but you'll shut people down. You might get things done, but you won't get them done well. You probably won't get them done on time. You won't get them done within a cost frame, and you won't get them done to the quality that you need, because people aren't going to listen to that anymore. Life has changed. Society has changed. We don't work like that. So when people think about management and they think about power, and often Machiavelli comes up, two things classically will come up. Machiavelli, the Prince, and Sun Tzu, The Art of War, will come up as classic management texts. People will say, oh, well, I've read this and I know, and I get them to do what I want them to do. And if they don't, well, there's trouble. But that doesn't work. In the longer term, that doesn't work, because management is all about relationships. And we have to build those relationships. So when we see things like Machiavelli and the Prince, and in the Prince, he says, hence a prince who wants to keep his authority must learn not to be good and use that knowledge or refrain from using it as necessity requires. And he goes on to say, conceal your intentions, hide what you're doing, don't tell anybody anything. Always say less than is necessary. And if any of you have seen my previous webinars, when we've talked about communication especially, talk about communicate. And then if you're not sure, communicate some more. And tell everybody everything unless there's a good reason not to. Because that's the way, I believe, that's the way that you build good relationships, you build good working relationships, you build trust, you build everything that you need in order to get things done, so that your team will support you, you can facilitate their success, facilitate their performance, and everybody wins. Keeping people in the dark doesn't work. Those days are gone. And when we think about power again, there's lots of quotes about power, and power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we need to be very careful how we use that power. We need to think about where is our power base? Is it through authority? Is it through knowledge? Is it through the things that we control? If we control finance, or if we control resources, does that give us a sense of power? And if it does, is that sense of power appropriate, or are we using that power inappropriately to stop people from doing things? we've all seen examples, haven't we, where you might go to the stores and you say, well, I need a new piece of kit, or I need this, and the first thing that happens is we'll justify it. Well, the justification is, you want me to do the work, you need to give me the kit. You want me to do a certain thing with IT, you need to give me IT that works and enables me to do that, rather than trying to frustrate my ability, because that makes you feel powerful. So that's a clear example of the impact of poor management. And we can say to people, other examples you see, I need some flexibility. I need to pick up my children this afternoon, or I need to go to the dentist, or whatever it might be. I need to take the car for an MOT, so I need to come in a bit later on Friday. Is that okay? And people say, no, I don't care. That's not my problem. What happens outside work has nothing to do with me. You're paid from 9 to 5, and I want you here from 9 to 5. So the person comes in and they sit there from 9 to 5. They're not productive, because all they're doing is worrying about their car. Who's going to pick up their children? Who's going to do this, that, and the other for them? Who's going to do the things that you won't let them do? And then when it comes to 5 o'clock and you say, we're really busy, can you stay? You're surprised when they say, no, I'm going home. I work 9 to 5. That's what you tell me, so I'm going home. So we need to think about how we use that power, how we use our authority. And the big difference here between power and authority is simply authority is given, power is taken. And that's a really interesting concept, because often people will allow people power over them. Now, you may have authority, but you don't necessarily have power. The two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And really, you want authority with respect and with that relationship that enables things to happen. Now, another interesting thing about power is, typically we recruit people because they have power, and power works like an anesthetic in a way. And I love this quote from Rutger Bregman. Power works like an anesthetic. It makes you insensitive to other people, and it disrupts mirroring and reduces empathy. Yet we continually employ people because we see them as powerful leaders. So we have this power paradox going on. We employ people and we select people to lead us because they are powerful, because of their social intelligence, apparent social intelligence. But the more power we give them, the greater the reduction on their social intelligence. So there's this strange paradox that the more power people have, the less they are often able to deal with everybody. So we have this strange situation going on, and that's really a terrible impact of management, poor management, because power is almost like a drug. And the more we get, the more we want. And when we see it's not respected, we become even more powerful, and we use that power in a very different and degrading and destructive way. So we need to be really careful about how we use our authority, how we use our assumed power. And it's really good here to ask yourself those ethical questions that I've talked about in the past. So if I do something and I use my power, would I be happy that my friends and family see me act in that way? Would I be happy that the way I act ends up on the front page of the paper tomorrow? And if not, should I be acting that way? And what is my gut telling me? Does this feel like the right thing to do? And if you answer no to any of those questions, I think you have to say, I need to revisit this. I need to talk to somebody about this. I need to get some 360 feedback. I need to get a mentor or a colleague that I trust. I can have those conversations with and say, do you think I'm doing this right? Do you think this works for this organization? Is this chiming with my values and my belief system? And if it's not, it's time to sit down, have a good think, give yourself a good talking to, try and reframe and reposition where you're coming from and work in a different way, because ultimately you won't be able to sustain it with your team, and you won't be able to sustain it personally either. It will become toxic for you as well as everybody else. Now, having talked about power and talked about authority and management and all the ways that we can do it wrong, let's have a look at some of the problems that can cause. And one of the big ones is employee turnover. And employee turnover is really, really expensive to do. There's a high cost of recruitment. If you need to train people, there's a high cost of training. We lose consistency, we lose continuity. There's a loss of skill involved every time somebody leaves. And remember, people don't leave jobs by and large. People leave managers. People take a job often because that's what they want to do. They want to use those skills they have. They want to work in that environment. They want to do good. They want to do something that they enjoy, something that pays them well, something they're rewarded. But remember, reward isn't just about money. Reward is about other things as well. So it's a sense of respect, that sense of well-being, that sense of achievement. And if you're stamping on that as a manager, so poor management will stop all those things happening, then people will leave. And you get this massive cost turnover. And you get this massive cost of replacement. Now, we also have to remember that you think about the team building. Think about Tuckman and his team building cycle. And every time somebody leaves, you're back to norming, storming, and performing. So when someone leaves, everybody else that's left goes back into that storming phase. Somebody's looking to fill the gap. Somebody new is coming that nobody knows. Everything is changing in this massive period of change all the time because there's this constant flux. Teams aren't able to build. Teams aren't able to form properly. There's always a sense of loss. There's often a sense of fear engaged in this as well because, it's that person today. Is it me tomorrow? That person was being picked on, shall we say, was being harassed, wasn't being supported, so they've left because of the manager. Great. That problem was theirs. Now the potential is it's mine. So we have this constant fear in the team and this constant sense of unease, unsettled, not able to perform. And that gets shown up in productivity as well as other things. Poor management will lead to poor employee health and well-being as well. Now, this is a massive one at the moment, and rightly so, in my opinion. This is something that we should have been thinking about a long time ago. But toxic environments lead to toxic health. Now, this isn't always physical health. This is often mental health. And as I say, if you're in a constant state of flux, if your team is constantly changing because poor management is leading to churn and people are coming and going, then you're going to have that toxic environment. Nobody stays here. Nobody lasts because of what's happening with the managers, what's happening with that management structure, with that culture that allows that to happen. So when we have poor management, we have to look at the whole organization. Why is this allowed to happen? And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. But employee health and well-being will lead to absence and turnover that we've seen. But absence is often worse than straight turnover in some ways. It's worse for the organization, it's worse for the team because you're not filling a gap. So you're asking other people to step up and step in. And it's much, much worse for the person who's absent because of their well-being, because it becomes very hard for people to come back. At what point do you say, I'm going to give this another try? If you go back into a toxic environment that's made you ill in the first place, made you unwell, at what point do you say, I'm strong enough now to do that? And what are your triggers that are going to kick you back again? Now, one of the other impacts of poor management is poor support around that. So people who are power hungry, they're not aware of their emotional quotation, they're not aware of their emotional intelligence, they're not aware of the impact they have personally on people. If you get somebody who's off work through a well-being issue and go back into that environment, you're going to have the same thing again. And it gets worse and worse and worse every time it happens. So we need to deal with this. We need to educate our managers. We need to train our managers. And as I said right at the beginning, we need to look at management in a very different way. It's not about order, it's about enabling. It's not about dictating, it's about supporting and facilitating. So we need to keep those things in mind all the time. If we threaten people, like I mentioned earlier, we end up with bullying becoming an issue. We end up with complaints. We end up with all sorts of problems that can be financial as well as emotional and physical for people. So we need to think about how we're doing this. Are we being the best we can be? And if we get into that toxic situation, it will have a really negative effect on productivity as well. The more we come down on people to get them to do what we want them to do, the more they will behave like a robot, like a monkey. We see this thing, don't we? You pay peanuts, you get monkeys. But you know what? If you treat people like monkeys, you get monkeys as well. You get this self-fulfilling circle going on, self-fulfilling prophecy, where the worse you behave, the worse productivity becomes. It's a bizarre paradox in a sense, because if you go back 20, 30 years, you would think, well, actually, if the more I'm strict with you, the more I tell you what to do, the more I govern you, if you like, the more you'll get done. But it didn't work then, and it most certainly doesn't work now because society's changed, life has changed. We look at young people coming into the workplace these days, and their expectations are very different to when some of us started work. Their expectations of control and management are very different to when some of us started work. And we have to try and balance the whole workforce when we're looking at how we're using our power. We're looking at how we're managing. Otherwise, we become very poor managers. That's another skill involved in managers. So we're looking at emotion, we're looking at power, we're looking at support, we're looking at facilitating, we're looking at communication, we're looking at relationships, we're looking at teams here and how we facilitate all of that. So you can see, as I mentioned earlier, we're no longer a specialist in a subject, we're now a specialist in management. That is our profession, that is our role. And that's what we do at CMI, and that's what we always try to encourage, and that's certainly what I've tried to encourage throughout my management career. Poor management also reduces quality, and we see this because people will start to do exactly what you tell them to do and nothing else. So it reduces quality, it affects creativity, it affects people's engagement with the organization, with the job role, with everything else. If this is the way you want to behave, I'm going to behave in a similar way, and I'm going to do exactly what I need to do and nothing else. I'm not going to do any more. You tell me to stamp this, I stamp that. That's it. Because if I do anything else, you jump on me, and I'm just going to focus on that. And you hate me and I hate you, so I'm just going to focus on that and take my paycheck at the end of the week. And that's what happens with poor managers and poor management as a result. Has a massive effect on staff morale. And some of these things we've already talked about. You get bad reputation, you get high absence, you get high churn, low productivity, and this lovely thing called the Abilene paradox. And it's worth looking this up on the internet if you get a chance. But the Abilene paradox is where everybody agrees to do something that nobody wants to do. So a poor manager will say, you're going to do this, and everybody says yes. Nobody wants to do it. Good chances the manager didn't want to do it either, but they're demonstrating how powerful they are. Look at me, I'm massively powerful. I get all the money, I earn the big bucks, I have the corner office, I have the car, and you will do what I say. And people will do what they say, but they do nothing else. And they won't do it well, they won't do a good job, they won't be creative, they won't be innovative, they won't make any suggestions as how we can do things better. They just do exactly what you tell them to do, badly. And we have to think about the other side of this. Why do people come to work? What is their intrinsic motivation for getting up and coming to work? Nobody comes to work intentionally to do a bad job, I don't believe. I mean, you may come across very, very few people that do that. But by and large, people come to work to do a good job, to get rewarded, both financially and emotionally and physically and all the rest of it. They come to work to do a good job. They come to work for your organization because they believe in your organization and they want to do a good job in that environment that you operate in. It's very easy to crush that. So be very careful about why people come to work, because if it is just a paycheck, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get just paycheck people, and they will do nothing else except work 9 to 5, 8 to 4, whatever it might be, in order to collect their check. And the first chance they get to slack off, to take a day off, to not turn up, to do something badly, they will do it, because why wouldn't they? Because every time they do something good, you're jumping on. So we need to think about all these things. And again, it's back to that facilitation and enabling rather than ordering and dictating. Now, this has a bigger effect than people as well. This can have a massive effect on your organization. So if you've got examples of bad management, you'll start to get things like bad Glassdoor reviews. You'll lose trust among suppliers and customers. And there was a big drive a few years ago. Tesco, for example, decided that they would only deal with companies that were being seen as ethical and were treating their people well. And I was doing some training for a food company at the time, and that food company had an audit done by Tesco's. And Tesco said, if you don't train your managers, if you don't train your people and deal with your people better and engage in a much better environment, we will stop dealing with you. So I was brought in at that point as a consultant to do some training for them, deliver their training and train their managers. But it was really interesting that the driver for that was one of the customers and suppliers was saying that you need to up your game or we'll find a different supplier. So these can have massive effects, not just on your staff, but external as well. It can affect your ethical position in terms of the way that other people see you. It can affect your CSR, your corporate social responsibility, in the way that other people view your organization. And may or may not want to continue to deal with you. And much more these days, and when we think about where we buy things from, many of us are thinking, I want to buy from an ethical supplier. Many people are thinking fair trade, for example. Many people are thinking, what's the overall halo of that organization? Do I deal with this organization, or do I choose not to because of the way they treat their suppliers, they treat their downstream people, and they treat their staff that I see in shops? Is their ethical position one that I want to get behind? Again, does it chime with my values? So if we're seeing that's not working, we'll stop dealing with those organizations, unless we're absolutely forced to, because that's the only one there. And if that's the only one there, we will minimize, by and large, our engagement with that organization, keep it to what we absolutely need rather than what we want. So you lose your share of the marketplace. You lose your customers. You get lack of transparency. People don't trust you. You might come out and say, we're an ethical organization, we do this, that, and the other. People won't believe you because what they're seeing isn't matching up with what you're saying. So there's a lack of authenticity. So we can see that poor management starts to have a much wider effect here. We're affecting staff, we're affecting morale and turnover and cost and all those things. But now we're starting to see it reflect outside of the organization as well. So our customers, our suppliers are making decisions around these things. In the very worst cases, it can be good night Vienna. We can lose the whole of our organization. We can have high levels of discipline issues. We can be sued by staff for bullying, harassment, poor management issues around all of those things. We can end up in employment tribunals. We can lose our reputation. We can end up with poor reviews on Glassdoor, like I said. We can have loss of trust, loss of business, loss of jobs. We find it hard to fill jobs because nobody wants to work for us because of our poor reputation, because of our managers. And this can be down to one or two individuals in an organization that are allowed to behave in the way that they behave. Now, there's a real big question around why managers are allowed to behave the way they behave. And that's very complex balance sometimes of what's going on there. Ultimately, though, this can be business closure. This can cost us the business, all because of poor management. Really, really, really serious impact of poor management is that the business can close. The business can fail because of the way we do things, because nobody wants to deal with a bad organization. And if our organization is seen as not only poor, but a bad organization, nobody wants to work there, nobody wants to do business with you, you can't fill jobs, you're always in court because of the employment tribunals, there's high levels of sickness. You mention a name of an organization and everybody locally will go, right there, And I remember years and years ago, I won't mention names, but I was working in an area where there was an organization locally where if people quit, that organization had such a bad reputation that if those people went to the job center and said, I've quit, the job center would allow them to sign on. Now, normally, if you quit a job, I don't know what it is now, but years ago, if you quit a job, there was a waiting period before you could sign on. But this organization had such a bad reputation that people that quit from there were allowed to sign on. Now, that's damning, isn't it? But that's a real big issue about poor management. So you can also see a bigger knock-on here, because there's a big knock-on for the taxpayer. Business is closed, everybody's out of work, they're allowed to go and sign on. Somebody's going to pick up the cost for that. So we need to think about all these things. Now, one of the things that happens is cultures allow these bad managers, poor managers, to behave in the way that they do. And often that's through lack of training, lack of education, lack of control, and imbalance of power between middle managers and senior managers, or what we could call blinkered vision from senior managers. I don't want to see this because if I see it, I have to deal with it. So I'm not going to look at it. So not only have you got poor management in some organizations, you've got poor leadership as well, which allows poor management to flourish. So if we're dealing with an organization like this, and certainly in my role as a consultant, if we're dealing with an organization like this, we have to deal with the whole organization from top to bottom. We have to deal with those difficult conversations. We've talked about difficult conversations before. We have to look at communication. We've talked about communication. And we have to think about what motivates people, what's their intrinsic value, what's our values within an organization, and make sure that those chime all the way through the organization in order that that organization becomes one of a high reputation, low turnover, low cost, high profitability, and goes on to flourish as an organization. Now, I've kind of gambled through that because of the time we have on available to us today, but there are lots of other resources available on Management Direct, and those of you who have access to Management Direct, it's really good to have a look at this. If you type in poor management as a search, there's a load of stuff on there that you can have a look at. We've got some questions to deal with, I think, as well. But final thoughts for you, a few takeaways. Power can be good or bad, and you need to decide how you use it. So you've got authority, think about the power you've got. Think about your personal power, how you're going to use it. Carrots and sticks only work for a short time. They're not long lasting. You won't be able to maintain that kind of management style. So I would avoid it in the first place because it doesn't work. Helping others develop is what our role is as a manager, and helping others to flourish and perform to their best ability is what our role is. We're enabling and we're facilitating. And we need to trust that their intrinsic motivation is good, trust that they will do a good job, avoid micromanaging them, but be there to support them when they need it. Check your ethics, ask yourself those ethical questions. How does this feel for me? What's my gut feeling? What would I want my family and friends to see? Would I want them to see the way I'm behaving? And if not, don't do it. And would I want the way I'm behaving to end up on the front page of the newspaper tomorrow? How would I feel about that? And lastly, and this is the most important one, especially when we're all in the situation that we're in at the moment, is be human. Be human, engage as much as possible, empathize as much as possible, and work that balance between what your staff need, what the organization needs, and what you need. That's your job as a manager. And hopefully all of those things will help. And I'm going to hand back to Lucia now, and we can take some questions, I believe.
Thank you, David. As always, very useful tips for us. And thank you to those of you who submitted your questions in advance. We have selected a few. The first one is from Kate. Kate is asking you, David, what do you think is the biggest contributor to poor management?
I think that's a really interesting question, Kate. And I think the answer for me is lack of training, lack of understanding of what the role of the manager is, and not just the old-fashioned idea that I'm now in charge and you will do what I say. But I think the biggest impact is lack of training, what we call accidental managers, people promoted without support and advice.
The next question is from Lee, and Lee is asking, how can we show that sending people on management training actually returns the positive return on investment, as management of staff tends to be intangible?
Oh, thanks, Lee. This is a really good one, and one I often get asked. And I think one of the things with any kind of training really is about measuring the negatives. So it's very difficult sometimes to measure the positives in training. You know, how do you say that somebody went on this training course and as such their behavior has changed? Because what we often see is behavior change anyway as a result of something else. So we have to think, well, how do we measure training? And the way I always recommend measuring training is to measure the negatives. So as a result of training, you will get less complaints, less turnover, less churn, increased profitability, or if you like, less reworking, less complaints about the product, all of those kinds of things. So we can say, you know, as a result of training, productivity has increased, quality has increased, but you're absolutely right when you say it's intangible. We can't always tie the two together. So I like to talk about reducing negatives as a way of measuring training.
Next question is from Tracy. She's asking, Why do best managers sometimes get overlooked by leaders who do not recognize good management skills?
I think this is an interesting one as well, Tracy. And I think where we are with this, it's often about culture, and there's culture and fear come into play here. Because if you've got leaders, senior managers, if you like, who are have come to that position through what we would nowadays call examples of poor management or bad management. So they've been brought up that way. That's the way they've been taught to behave. We now see that as wrong. We recognise that's not acceptable. So what we would refer to these days as good managers, come into play and are not supported because there's a sense of fear in the senior team that this is how we should behave. I can't behave like that. I don't want to behave like that. I'm 4 years away from retirement, wherever it might be. I'm not prepared to change, so I'm going to stick to my guns and stick to my old ways of doing things. And it's rather like, when some of us went to school, our teachers were taught by people who were taught by Victorians. So you have this Victorian idea going through, and that's kind of what happens. How people are brought up through an organisation reflects the way they lead, and it does require a big change of thinking and a cultural change in the organisation as well to enable those middle managers and junior managers to flourish. And it's behaving on senior teams and C-suite teams to be able to say, okay, your role is to facilitate, our role is also to facilitate, and how can we do that in a way that helps you become a much better manager and also enables me to become a better manager and leader at the same time. But where you see it not recognised is often to do with culture and fear, and that's a much bigger job, and that's where you need an outsider to come in and say, hold on a minute, this is not where it needs to be, because often people inside the organisation don't feel they can say that, aren't listened to because they're not costing £2,000 a day, so they're not seen as having a value that a consultant might have or an external firm might have who comes in to do something. It's a very complex situation. But thanks for raising that. It's a really good question.
Next question is from you. If poor management occurs, should the organization be required to address such poor management, particularly if it takes place in a public sector organization? Should poor managers be held to account, or should they be allowed to shield under the guise of a no-blame culture?
That's a really interesting question here, and thank you for it. And I think it's one that's very apt at the moment as well. I think there's a big difference here between no blame and accountability. And I think when we look at accountability, it's not about blaming people. It's not about saying you're wrong, this is your fault. But it is about saying you've made a mistake here. You're accountable for that mistake. How do we enable you to learn from that mistake? And how do we make sure that that doesn't happen again, rather than saying you're to blame, you're fired, we'll carry on as normal? That's not what this is about. And certainly poor management needs to be called out wherever it's seen. And again, this is really interesting because it's kind of, and this is a cultural thing as well, it's kind of, it behoves on all of us really to call out examples of poor management whenever we see it, as we would with anything else that's unacceptable. And it's easy to say that, but it's a real challenge to do it. And it's really difficult for a lot of us to say that's not acceptable. But by not saying it's not acceptable, we're adding to the problem in a sense, because we are saying that's fine. Saying nothing is saying that's fine, that's acceptable. So we need to be able to identify who do we go to if we see examples of bad management. Who in the organisation can we approach in order to report this, in order to discuss this, in order to raise our concerns about examples of poor management? Not within a blame culture, but within that accountability culture. And accountability has to be maintained, but blame is pointless. So we need to discover who we need to go to, who can we talk to, who can help us with this. And if there is nobody in your organisation that can do that, if you have an organisation where you can't raise these issues, you can't raise your concerns, you have nobody to speak to, I would suggest you put more energy in trying to find another organisation that better suits your values and better suits your individual culture and identity, because long term, that's not going to be sustainable for you and it's only going to cause you problems.
Thanks, David. We're going to move on to the live questions. There are a few. Thank you for submitting those. First one is from Alessio. In a big organization, some managers might be good, but some other might not be. What is the best way to ensure the higher management engages with these poor managers to help them develop? Any tips?
Yeah, one of the things I would do, and thanks for this, Alessio, one of the things I would do is look at management teams. So I would have a middle management team just of managers, senior management team, and a C-suite team if it's that size of organization. And I would look at building in development opportunities. I would look at things like buddying. I would look at things like work sharing, 360 feedback loops, all those kinds of things where you can identify if you've identified your lesser managers, I'm not going to say poor in this instance, if you've identified your lesser managers, get them to buddy up, get them to share, work share, observe good managers in operation. So hopefully they can learn from that. I would also look at brainstorming events for that management team, sharing examples of what's worked well for them, what hasn't worked well for them. But in order to do that, you have to work on the culture first, and you have to have that culture that's open, engaging, prepared to communicate with each other, and do that in a safe space. Have a space where you can say what you need to say that stays in that environment. That isn't then people aren't judged by what they say. We don't have this idea of stupid questions. There are no stupid questions, just silly answers. And have that system in place where people feel free and feel safe to have those very frank discussions with each other and be able to say, do you know what, you do that so much better than me. Can you show me how to do that? You're getting much better results from your team than I'm getting. Can we have a chat about why that might be the case? So we have coaching, mentoring, lots of opportunities for managers to develop as well. Now, what often happens, of course, in a lot of poor organizations is people get promoted to a management post and that's it. They don't get sent on any training. They don't get developed. You're the manager now. You get the big bucks. You're accountable. Do what you need to do. And if you don't do it, we'll get somebody else. So this perpetuates all the way through, not just with teams, but with managers. And we need to get to a position where we're not seeing that happen.
Okay. Dan question. What is the best method to communicate to your team that you want to know when you're failing them? Would a manager contract be the most effective way?
It could be, Dan. I mean, one of the common ways and one of the simple ways of doing this is have regular 360s. So not only are you looking at your team, but you're asking your team to look at you and getting feedback from your team in that 360 process. Now, that works if you're able to take on feedback, if you're able to take feedback as a gift and deal with it in a way that's constructive and supportive. So you're open to that critical analysis, if you like, of what people think about you. You can only do that, and you should only do that if you're going to deal with what comes back. If you get people feedback to you and then you don't deal with it, you're going to worsen the situation rather than improve it. But that's a very good way to do it, in my experience. Make it anonymous, though. Make it anonymous so people don't feel that they have to say things that you want to hear. Make it anonymous and that they're more likely to say what they need to say.
What recommendation do you have for making a start with assessing where an organization is in terms of their management quality?
I would first of all, I would look at what the staff are saying. I would look at what the senior team are saying. I would look at what the customers and suppliers are saying as well, and have a feedback exercise with all of those different groups, so you get a picture of what is happening within that organization. Look at what everybody inside and outside of that organization who touches that organization in some way feels and thinks about that organization, and you get a good picture of what's happening. Don't just listen to one voice.
Questions keep on coming. A lot to please you all. Let's go with the next one. What are your top tips for addressing an employee whose opening ambit is to invite you into the old paradigm of employee dependence?
I'm not sure I understand that question. What are your top tips for addressing an employee who's opening gambit is to invite you into the old paradigm improvement. I would have a conversation with them and try and understand where they're coming from in that, what's behind their thinking of that, and how are they imagining or seeing that play out, and what's the benefit of that before you start to disagree with it or agree with it. I would want to know why they're coming from that old paradigm, what they're looking at, what they're trying to achieve from that. With any question, I always like to know what's going on behind it. Somebody approaches me with a problem. Why is it a problem? What are you hoping to do if you change it? Or what are you hoping to achieve if you don't change it and you stay as you are?
Thank you. I'm going to pick the last one for today from Xander. Can one become a better manager without having the right resources?
Ooh, I think it depends what you call the right resources. I think there's always access to resources. They might not come from inside. They might not, they might not be supplied by the organization, but libraries are full of books that are free. There's loads of stuff on the internet that can help you find somebody outside the organization if it's not being supplied inside the organization that you can talk to, that you can think about what's going on. You can have a look at, what's best practice like elsewhere. So I think the idea of resources is, again, thinking about where's this question coming from, is what do you mean by resources? Why are resources not available to you? And is there an opportunity to get those resources outside of your organization, if not with inside your organization? So to answer the question, yes, I think you can, but it's harder. It's much harder.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us and participated today. And thank you, David, once again for sharing your knowledge with us. If you're a member of CMI or subscribe to our content, you can find thousands of exclusive development resources in Management Direct. To log into Management Direct, you can visit our website. If you're not yet a member, you can join our community for access to a great range of practical tools and materials to apply your learnings from today. You're welcome to sign up to our free CMI newsletter for the latest trends and tips for managers and leaders. Once again, I hope you found today's session really interesting. I did. And I'd like to wish you all a great day and see you again soon.
Thanks, Lucia. Thanks, everyone.